Prohibition had nothing to do with alcohol. That sounds wrong, but by 1907, 13 years before the national ban, 8 southern states had already gone dry. And the people pushing those laws weren't hiding their reasons. A Tennessee newspaper spelled it out plainly. The South needed prohibition to keep whiskey away from black men. That's where this story starts, not in Chicago, not in 1920, in Atlanta in 1906, when a race massacre became the most useful piece of propaganda the dry movement had ever seen. On a Saturday evening in the Mississippi Delta, a sharecropper finished his week's work and walked down a dirt road to a wooden building with lamplight coming through the cracks. Inside, someone was playing guitar. There was corn whiskey on the table. He would be back at work before sunrise Monday. This was the only night he had. 500 miles north, a farmer's wife pulled a jug from behind the root cellar wall. Her husband had distilled it himself from the same corn he'd grown, using the same copper still his father had brought over from Scottish-Irish stock. It wasn't a luxury, it was currency, medicine, and ritual all at once. Neither of them knew that within 20 decades, the government would make their way of life a criminal enterprise, not just through the national prohibition most Americans learn about in school, but through a sustained, targeted campaign that started earlier, moved faster, and hit harder in the South. This is the story of 25 ways that happened. 1. The South didn't wait for 1920. Most accounts treat January 17, 1920 as the starting gun. The 18th Amendment takes effect, the saloons close, Al Capone buys a new suit. But in the South, that date was almost an afterthought. By the time national prohibition arrived, 8 southern states had already been dry for years. Georgia went dry in 1907, Mississippi and North Carolina followed in 1908, Tennessee in 1909. Oklahoma wrote prohibition into its state constitution from the start when it entered the Union in 1907. By 1915, 5 years before the 18th Amendment, the majority of the Southern South had already outlawed alcohol at the state level. This was a deliberate political strategy, and the stated reasons had very little to do with temperance. 2. The Atlanta Massacre was the catalyst. In September 1906, Atlanta exploded. 2 newspapers were running fabricated stories about black men assaulting white women. On September 22nd, white mobs took to the streets and attacked, shot, and lynched African Americans throughout the city for 3 days. At least 25 were killed. The real number was likely higher. What happened next was revealing. The violence had been committed by white men, incited by white newspaper editors. But the prohibitionist movement concluded the root cause was alcohol, specifically alcohol sold in black-owned saloons on Decatur Street. The Atlanta race riot became the single most powerful propaganda tool the dry movement had ever acquired. Prohibitionists immediately capitalized on the violence, blaming liquor and using the episode as direct leverage for a statewide ban. Less than a year later, Governor Hoke Smith, who had served as editor of one of the newspapers that ran the false stories, signed the law that made Georgia the first southern state to go dry. The connection between that law and the massacre was not hidden, it was openly discussed. 3. The newspapers said the quiet part out loud. The racial purpose of Southern prohibition was not always dressed up in the language of morality. Sometimes it was stated plainly. On February 6, 1907, the Knoxville Sentinel published an editorial. If the Southern states adopt prohibition, it will be largely because of the necessity of keeping whiskey from the colored man. That sentence appeared in a major Tennessee newspaper, and nobody disavowed it. It wasn't a fringe position. The temperance cause, which in other parts of the country drew on arguments about family welfare and Protestant morality, had in the South been fused with the infrastructure of racial control. The newspapers knew it and printed it.
4. Southern prohibition was a Jim Crow policy. The 5 southern states that went dry between 1907 and 1909 had a specific and consistent effect. They shuttered Black-owned businesses, eliminated community gathering places in Black neighborhoods, and gave law enforcement a new pretext to harass Black men. These were functioning Jim Crow laws. They operated alongside poll taxes, literacy tests, and vagrancy statutes as instruments of the same project, the removal of Black political and economic power. And they worked through formal legal machinery, which made them harder to challenge. The Anti-Saloon League drew most of its support from Protestant evangelical churches, but its political strategy required a specific precondition: the disenfranchisement of Black voters. When Black men could vote, they voted overwhelmingly Republican, a threat to Southern Democrat control. The disenfranchisement, accomplished through poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and violence in the decades after Reconstruction, had to come first. Once it did, Prohibitionists could assemble working majorities in Southern statehouses and began closing counties, then states, one by one. 5. The Anti-Saloon League knew exactly what it was doing. Founded in 1893 in Oberlin, Ohio, the Anti-Saloon League became within 2 years the most powerful lobbying organization in the country. Its leader, Wayne Bidwell Wheeler, invented what analysts would later call pressure politics, flooding public discourse with propaganda, tracking every elected official's voting record on liquor, and threatening retribution against those who crossed them. They printed over 40 tons of mail per month from Westerville, Ohio. Much of the League's propaganda leveraged racial fear directly. The images and stories it circulated painted Black men, Catholic immigrants, and foreign drinkers as threats to white Protestant families. Renowned lawyer Clarence Darrow made the connection explicit in 1924. "I would not say every anti-saloon leaguer is a Ku Kluxer, but every Ku Kluxer is an anti-saloon leaguer." That wasn't hyperbole, it was a description of actual organizational overlap. 6. The Ku Klux Klan used Prohibition as a license. The second wave Klan of the 1920s had between 2 and 5 million members. A significant portion were the same people who had supported Prohibition, attended the same Protestant churches, and voted for the same dry politicians. The Volstead Act provided what one historian described as a new mandate for the Klan's anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant white Protestant nationalism. The mechanism was straightforward. The Klan presented itself as a law enforcement organization that could do what the government wouldn't: shut down bootleggers and the establishments where undesirables gathered. In Southern communities, this meant raiding Black nightclubs and juke joints under the banner of Prohibition enforcement. Law enforcement couldn't easily be criticized for breaking up establishments that were technically violating federal law. The Klan's raids on Black drinking establishments weren't prosecuted as mob violence. They were framed as civic duty. 7. The law punished sellers, not buyers. Under the Volstead Act, drinking alcohol was perfectly legal. Selling it was not. This distinction had enormous consequences for who bore the risk. The wealthy man who kept a stocked private cellar was operating entirely within the law. The man who sold him the bottle or ran the roadhouse where the laborer got a drink after a 70-hour week was a criminal. In practice, the enforcement burden fell almost entirely on the supply side. Black business owners, poor white Appalachian farmers, and working-class operators who lacked the political connections or resources to buy their way out of a charge. The buyers, often white, often middle class, often the same people voting for dry candidates, faced no legal exposure at all. The system was not blind. It saw exactly who it was designed to catch.
8. Wealthy Southerners had their own private exemptions. When Georgia went dry in 1907, the law left a significant gap. Private clubs serving only their own members were not covered by the prohibition on public sales. Within weeks, locker clubs appeared across the state. Wealthy Georgians joined them, kept their personal supplies on the premises, and drank as they always had. This loophole operated for years before political pressure forced a special legislative session in 1915 to close it. In the meantime, one successful Atlanta lawyer documented his experience in diaries that were later archived. During Georgia's statewide prohibition, he obtained alcohol easily through a private club, and after that loophole closed, through bootleggers and speakeasies. He never stopped drinking, he just changed his suppliers. The people who campaigned for dry laws in church halls often continued to drink. They simply could afford what illegality added to the price. 9. A political murder in Nashville set the stage. On November 8, 1908, in downtown Nashville, Edward Ward Carmack, former U.S. Senator, editor of the Nashville Tennessean, and one of the most prominent voices for Prohibition in Tennessee, was shot dead on the street. His killer was the son of a leading figure in the anti-prohibition faction of Tennessee Democrats. The two sides had been bitter enemies. Carmack had recently published a scathing personal attack on the elder man in his newspaper. His martyrdom gave the Dry faction a rallying point they had not had before. The Tennessee state legislature moved toward prohibition with new urgency. The state went fully dry in 1909. What this illustrates is how intensely personal and violent the prohibition fight was in the South. Not an abstract policy debate, but a conflict that ran along the deepest lines of Southern political identity, in which men were willing to kill and be killed over the question of whether a glass of whiskey should be legal. 10. The 4-Mile Law, how Tennessee targeted communities quietly. Before going dry statewide, Tennessee had developed a quieter instrument, the 4-Mile Law, which prohibited alcohol sales within 4 miles of any school outside incorporated towns. In rural Tennessee, where small schoolhouses dotted the countryside, this effectively made vast swaths of agricultural land automatically dry. The law was then extended and tightened repeatedly. By mid-1903, all towns in Tennessee with fewer than 5,000, except 6, had voted dry. By 1909, Tennessee was entirely dry, not through a single dramatic vote, but through a decade of incremental legislation that wrapped the state in restrictions, one township at a time. This was Southern Prohibition at its most methodical, not a sudden declaration, but a slow encirclement, and at each stage, enforcement fell hardest on communities with the least political power to resist. 11. The Scots-Irish tradition was criminalized. Long before there was a prohibition, the people who settled the southern mountains were making whiskey. They had been doing it for generations before coming to America. The Scots-Irish immigrants who settled Appalachia in the 18th and early 19th centuries brought their distilling traditions from Scotland and Ireland, where home distilling was a normal part of agricultural life. In the old country, it was how you preserved excess grain, converted into a shelf-stable portable commodity. In the mountains of North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, the same logic applied. A horse could carry 4 bushels of corn over a mountain. Those same 4 bushels, once distilled, became 16 gallons of whiskey, worth far more and far easier to transport. This was not a subculture or a vice, it was a survival economy. When Prohibition arrived, it didn't encounter a moral vacuum in Appalachia. It encountered a centuries-old tradition with deep roots, practical justifications, and a community that had always viewed the federal tax collector with deep suspicion. The revenuers had been a persistent annoyance for mountain communities since the 1870s. National prohibition turned the entire region into a federal enforcement target. 12. Moonshining went from survival to big business. The moment the 18th Amendment took effect, something unexpected happened.
The demand for illegal whiskey didn't shrink, it exploded. Every city in the country was suddenly dry on paper, but people who had been drinking for their entire lives didn't stop wanting to drink. They simply needed new suppliers. And the people who had been quietly producing corn whiskey in Appalachian hollows for generations already had the equipment, knowledge, and distribution networks. They just needed to scale up. Hundreds of moonshiners ran their illegal distillery for round the clock during the Prohibition years, sending barrels of alcohol to bootleggers who shipped them to thirsty cities as far away as Chicago and Kansas City. The Mountain Still, which had operated for generations as a family-scale subsistence enterprise, became part of a national supply chain. Prohibition was, by every account from those who lived through it in Appalachia, the best economic event the region had seen in living memory. It turned a marginally profitable tradition into the most lucrative business in the mountains. The law had not ended Southern whiskey culture, it had supercharged it. 13. The revenuers became an occupation. To mountain communities, the revenuer was not a neutral law enforcement officer. He was an outsider with a federal badge coming into a closed community to destroy property, arrest neighbors, and impose rules the community never accepted as legitimate. Cooperating with federal agents was understood not as civic duty, but as betrayal. Communities protected their moonshiners. Stills were hidden in creek beds, behind waterfalls, inside mountain caves. Smoke from the distilling process was managed by burning dry hardwood that produced less of it, or by distilling at night. The term moonshine itself reflected this evasion. You ran your still by moonlight when no one could see the smoke. Enforcement was dangerous and deeply contested. There were shootouts, there were ambushes. The federal government assigned agents to Appalachian territory with the full understanding that it was hostile country, not because the people there were violent by temperament, but because they had been making this particular argument with the government for 150 years before the 18th Amendment was ratified. 14. The juke joint was the soul of Black Southern life. The juke joint emerged after emancipation as one of the first social spaces that Black Southerners controlled entirely for themselves. Under slavery, gathering had been prohibited. After emancipation, the formal infrastructure of public life remained segregated. Black men and women could not enter white saloons, restaurants, or theaters. The public world was closed to them, so they built private ones. A juke joint might be a former sharecropper's shack at a crossroads, a back room of a house, a cinder block building near a railroad stop. What made it a juke joint wasn't the architecture, it was the function. It was where you went on Saturday night, the one night of the week that was yours, to drink, to dance, to hear music, to be around people who understood your life. Zora Neale Hurston wrote in 1934, "Musically speaking, the Juke is the most important place in America, for in its smelly, shoddy confines has been born the secular music known as blues, and on blues has been founded jazz." Robert Johnson, Son House, Charlie Patton, they worked the juke joint circuit, developing their craft in front of audiences who were living the experiences those songs described. 15. The law was used to close those spaces. When Southern states went dry, the juke joint became a target, not because the law described juke joints specifically, but because it gave law enforcement authority to enter, search, and close any establishment where alcohol was sold without a license. In the South, that description covered nearly every Black social establishment outside the church. Juke joints sold whiskey. They nearly always did. They operated without licenses, both because licenses were expensive and because Black-owned establishments were informally excluded from obtaining them. When a sheriff wanted to shut down a Black community's gathering place, the tools were always within reach. In some areas, this operated as an informal protection racket. The sheriff was paid to stay away, and as long as payments continued, the joint was left alone. When payments stopped, the raid came. The community had no legal recourse. The operator was arrested, the whiskey confiscated, the building sometimes destroyed. Then, a few weeks later, somewhere down the road, another juke joint would open, because the need never went away. 16. Before Prohibition, beer was the most common alcoholic beverage in America. It was what working people drank in saloons, affordable, low in alcohol, available everywhere. Whiskey was for special occasions or for mountain men who made it themselves. Prohibition inverted that entirely. Beer is heavy, fragile, and difficult to conceal. A barrel of beer is obvious. A flask of whiskey is not. When the illegal market replaced the legal one, it immediately shifted toward the most concealable, highest value product, which was always concentrated spirits. Moonshiners didn't make beer. Bootleggers didn't ship it. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, American drinking culture had undergone a structural shift. A generation had grown up with hard liquor as the default. The beer-centric saloon culture of working-class American life was gone, not because people had been persuaded to give up beer, but because the underground market had forced a substitution that the legal market, when it returned, could not fully reverse. 17. The Southern bootlegger built a supply network. During Prohibition, Appalachian moonshiners and Mississippi juke joint operators became nodes in a distribution system stretching from mountain hollows to the nightclubs of Chicago. A family still in the mountains of Tennessee or North Carolina would produce whiskey far beyond local consumption. A bootlegger would collect the output, load it into a vehicle, and transport it to a city or larger distribution point. The entire chain operated on cash and personal trust. No contracts, no receipts, only the reliability of the individual and the threat of violence for those who violated it. The vehicles used for transportation became an engineering culture unto themselves. Bootleggers modified their cars with reinforced suspensions, hidden compartments, and engines built for speed on winding mountain roads. The drivers who were best at this work were working professionals with finely developed skills, and when legal racing began to formalize in the post-war South, an unusual number of its early stars came from exactly this background. Robert Glenn Jr. Johnson came from a long line of North Carolina moonshiners, spent time in federal prison for owning an illegal still, and the skills he developed running whiskey on mountain roads became the foundation of a racing career that helped build the entire sport of stock car racing. NASCAR was, in a very direct sense, a product of Southern Prohibition.
18. Women had their own role in the underground. The popular image of Southern moonshining was male, the farmer at his still in the woods, running from revenuers. That image left out a substantial part of what actually happened. Women participated in the moonshine economy throughout its history. Because they were less likely to be suspected, women frequently served as lookouts, business managers, and financial handlers. Women ran delivery routes that men couldn't. A woman carrying a jug on a rural road attracted less attention than a man with the same jug. There were also women who ran their own distilling operations. During Prohibition, when male family members were incarcerated or absent, women sometimes inherited the still and the customer base along with everything else. These were not celebrated figures. They operated in the same legal danger as the men around them. The women who kept those operations running were, in almost every case, invisible to the historical record. 19. Mississippi became the last state to let go. When national prohibition ended in December 1933, most states moved quickly to repeal their dry laws. The economic argument alone was compelling, with the Great Depression underway and liquor tax revenue desperately needed. The South moved slower. Georgia kept statewide prohibition until 1935, but no state held on as long as Mississippi. Mississippi remained the last completely dry state in America until 1966, 33 years after the rest of the country had moved on. It had been the first state to ratify the 18th Amendment in 1918, and with a kind of grim consistency, the last to let go of what that amendment had created.
Even the 1966 repeal wasn't a clean break. When the Alcohol Beverage Control Law took effect, no county automatically became wet. Each county had to hold its own referendum. Most remained dry. The legal mechanism of statewide prohibition had ended, but the structure it had built, a patchwork of local dry laws covering most of the state, simply continued under a different name. 20. The dry county map was a map of the old Confederacy. Look at a map of dry and restricted sale counties in the United States today, and you are looking at something that is not random. The heaviest concentrations are in Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee, and parts of Alabama, Oklahoma, and Texas. They follow, with remarkable fidelity, the geographic and cultural boundaries of the former Confederate South. This is not a coincidence of religion alone, though religion is part of the explanation. It is the compounded residue of over a century of prohibition law, state laws, local option laws, enforcement patterns, and the social norms that hardened around all of them. Communities that were forced into legal dryness for decades developed institutional habits, religious cultures, and political identities built around that dryness. As recently as 2015, residents of Arkansas counties voted to maintain their dry status. Mississippi only reversed its default setting in 2020, when Governor Tate Reeves signed a bill making counties wet unless they voted to go dry. The movement that began targeting black saloons on Decatur Street in Atlanta in 1907 is still, more than a century later, shaping what a person can legally purchase in much of the South.
21. Moore County and the Jack Daniels Paradox. There is a town in the hills of Tennessee called Lynchburg, home of one of the most famous whiskey brands in the world. Jack Daniels Tennessee whiskey has been produced there since 1866. The distillery draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. You cannot buy a bottle of Jack Daniels in Lynchburg. Moore County, where Lynchburg sits, is a dry county. The distillery has a specific legal exemption allowing it to sell small commemorative bottles directly on the premises, but the product it produces cannot be purchased in the county's stores or served in its restaurants. This is not a recent irony. It is a product of exactly the same history that made Tennessee dry by legislative default in 1909. The communities surrounding the Jack Daniels distillery were part of that movement. Those reasons survived repeal, survived the decades that followed, and have survived into the present. Moore County is dry. Jack Daniels is a Moore County institution. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and neither one is going anywhere. 22. The bones of juke joint culture. The juke joints that survived Prohibition and continued through the mid-20th century were not relics. They were living institutions. After 1933, the threat that replaced Prohibition was just different. Jim Crow was still fully operational. The juke joint was still, as one scholar wrote, the last retreat. The blues circuit that ran through the Mississippi Delta in the 30s and 40s, producing or developing nearly every major figure in American popular music, was a juke joint circuit. Musicians traveled from establishment to establishment, playing for whatever the crowd could pay, developing craft in front of audiences who were living the experiences those songs described. Muddy Waters played juke joints in the Delta before moving to Chicago. B.B. King started in the Mississippi Hills. The music that came out of those spaces, the blues, its children in rhythm and blues, its grandchildren in rock and roll, eventually became the dominant commercial music of the entire Western world. The British musicians who created what Americans called the British invasion were, by their own testimony, attempting to play the music they had heard from Southern black Americans. That chain ran directly from a tin-roofed shack at a Mississippi crossroads to every stadium in the world. The juke joint produced that. The one Prohibition tried to close, Jim Crow tried to contain, and law enforcement tried to raid out of existence.
23. The Foxfire Generation and What Moonshining Preserved. In 1972, a school teacher in Rabun Gap, Georgia, published a book that had originally been a student project. The Foxfire book was a collection of Appalachian folk practices compiled by high school students from interviews with elderly community members. It included detailed accounts of moonshining, not as crime, but as craft, recipes, equipment descriptions, the specific decisions that went into producing a good corn whiskey. The men and women interviewed were old by then. Many had been active during Prohibition. What they described was not law-breaking as a moral choice. It was the continuation of a tradition they had inherited from their parents, who had inherited it from theirs, going back through the mountains to Scotland and Ireland. The Prohibition crackdown hadn't destroyed that tradition, but it had profoundly changed it. Before the 18th Amendment, a mountain family still was an economic asset, something you might acknowledge to a neighbor. After Prohibition, it had to be hidden. The knowledge became secret, passed only within the family. The tradition survived, but in a damaged form, isolated, criminalized, and stripped of its legitimate place in the economy and culture that had originally produced it. 24. After Prohibition ended, the South stayed dry and moonshining continued. When the 18th Amendment was repealed in 1933, most of the South remained dry under local and state laws. The market those laws created, demand for illegal alcohol in areas where legal alcohol was unavailable, kept moonshining economically viable long after the national experiment ended. The Great Depression added another layer. In a region with high unemployment and few economic alternatives, the still in the woods was often the only available source of cash income. Converting corn to whiskey and whiskey to money was not a lifestyle choice, it was arithmetic. Then, in the 1950s, the price of sugar, a critical ingredient in many moonshine recipes, more than tripled. This single economic shock drove many moonshiners out of business, not because they'd been caught, but because the margin disappeared. By the time the 60s and 70s arrived, the traditional Appalachian moonshine industry was a fraction of its peak, but it had not died. In parts of the Deep South that remained dry through the remainder of the 20th century, bootleggers were still importing alcohol from wet counties across the line and selling it at a premium to their dry county neighbors. The legal map of the South had never returned to what it was before 1907. Some portion of the structure of Prohibition simply never left. 25. What the South lost and what never came back. There is an accounting cost that the Prohibition movement never submitted to. It eliminated the corn whiskey economy of the Appalachian Mountains, which had sustained subsistence farming communities for generations, and replaced it with a criminalized version of the same system that put those farmers at risk of federal prosecution. It shuttered black-owned saloons that were, in many southern cities, among the few independent businesses black entrepreneurs had managed to establish under Jim Crow. It gave the Ku Klux Klan a legitimate mandate to raid black establishments under the cover of federal law enforcement, and that cover was used extensively. It drove the Juke joint, the institution producing the most significant musical culture in American history, underground and into legal jeopardy for decades. Nationally, the liquor industry had been the fifth largest in America before Prohibition. Its closure eliminated thousands of jobs and billions in tax revenue at exactly the moment the country was heading toward economic catastrophe. State and local governments turned increasingly to income taxes to fill the gap, a structural shift in American public finance that outlasted Prohibition by decades. The musical legacy is harder to quantify. Robert Johnson, Charlie Patton, Son House, they played those spaces because those spaces were the only ones available to them. The music they made shaped the entire trajectory of popular music in the 20th century. That lineage ran directly through a set of establishments the law spent years trying to destroy. What Southern Prohibition accomplished in the end was the criminalization of a culture, several cultures, overlapping in complex ways. The Scots-Irish distilling tradition, the Black community gathering space, the economic independence of the mountain farmer, the Saturday night of the sharecropper. All of it was reframed by law as a social problem requiring suppression. Mississippi was the first state to ratify the 18th Amendment in January 1918. It was the last state to repeal its own prohibition in 1966, 33 years after the national experiment ended. A state that could maintain legal dryness through the Great Depression, through World War II, through post-war prosperity, through the beginning of the civil rights movement, that speaks to something that temperance movement's stated ideals cannot account for. The Knoxville Sentinel said it plainly in 1907. If the Southern states adopt prohibition, it will be largely because the necessity of keeping whiskey from the colored man. That sentence was not a slip. It was a statement of policy, and the policy it described operated for the better part of a century. The tin-roofed building at the crossroads where a man went on Saturday night with the only free hours his week would give him, that building is almost certainly gone now. Po Monkey's Lounge in Marigold, Mississippi, one of the last of those original spaces, closed in 2016 when its owner, Willie Seabury, died after running it for more than 40 years. The Blue Front Cafe in Bentonia, Mississippi, opened in the 1940s, built from cinder block near the Illinois Central Railroad, is still open as of this writing, run by Jimmy Duck Holmes, the last living practitioner of the Bentonia blues style. When he goes, there will be very few left who remember playing that music in the building where it was born, in the places where the law spent generations trying to put it out.